And welcome to Off the Couch with Dr. Greg. I'm Dr. Greg Cason. This is where psychology meets everyday life. I'm here with producer Brian Gomez.
Happy Monday, you guys.
And also DJ Sammy G on the board. Hi, Sammy. And today on Off the Couch, we're going to be talking about, for Psychology in the News, we're going to be talking about torturing tourists. Because, you know, in Barcelona, residents are squirting tourists with water guns. So I'm going to talk about that and talk about a study that came out this week in how tourists respond to anger and fear while traveling. But first, I wanted to talk about my own tourism vacation, my own horror story. This was in 2009. I'd actually lived in my house for about 5 years. I didn't. When I bought a house, I don't know about the rest of you. When you get a house, there's no way you can spend money on anything. So my very first vacation after, since I'm moving in, so I was living there 5 years, I decided to take a vacation. And we decided to go to Mexico. So I live in Los Angeles, and going to Mexico on a cruise is really an easy thing. You just actually go down to the Long Beach terminal and you just hop on a ship and off you go. You can park your car there. It's the world's easiest cruise to take. And this was a cruise on Royal Caribbean, Mariner of the Seas, heading out to Mazatlan, Puerto Vallarta, and Cabo San Lucas. And it was over October 18th through the 25th. Now, I'll forgive you if you don't know what was going on that week in 2009, but here we go. As we were coming on the cruise, news broke out. So this was the day before the cruise, that a hurricane was developing off the coast of Mexico. This was Hurricane Rick, which ended up being one of the most intense Pacific hurricanes on records. It was the third most intense hurricane that's ever on record for that region, off the Pacific coast of Mexico. This was the second most intense tropical cyclone worldwide in 2009. So this was a very, very intense storm. I think by the time it got up to its hurricane status, it was 155 mile an hour winds, which I believe is a Category 4 hurricane, but right on the verge of a Category 5 hurricane. It developed off the southern coast of Mexico on October 15th. Its rapid intensification was due to favorable conditions, and it became a hurricane within 24 hours of being a tropical depression. This was a rapid hurricane. It was rapidly developing. And so go ahead and put up those pictures of the hurricane if you can. This was the impact of Hurricane Rick. Hurricane Rick was one of the strongest hurricanes recorded in the region, and it severely impacted this cruise. And this was there was a lot of wondering of what would happen. So as this hurricane is developing, and if you're watching the YouTube video, you can see this is the intended pathway of the hurricane. This is directly where we were headed. We were headed to Puerto Vallarta and Mazatlan. It was not intended to head out over to Cabo San Lucas, if you know the geography. The dotted lines are what the actual pathway is, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The actual pathway ended up being something very different. So let me talk to you about what it's like when you're going down and you don't know what's going to happen. So here's this cruise coming up, and we know this hurricane is developing. We don't know how intense it's going to be. And there's a lot of talk about this is getting rapid very quickly. And then we're talking to different people, and we called the cruise line. The cruise line said, if you cancel the cruise, that you will lose all of your payment. That's it, like over and done with. If we cancel the cruise, we'll give you credit for another ride. And so I'm like, it's going to have a hurricane. They've got to cancel this. So we kept thinking they would cancel it, but we packed for a cruise and we drove down there, and then they're like, well, we're going to let you on the ship and we'll see. And everyone was still wondering, is this going to happen? I'm not even kidding. It was completely a question. Now, there was even a pre-cruise cocktail party the night before, and I went to this pre-cruise cocktail party. It was not on the ship. It was actually at a bar, and we actually had, I met a bunch of people who are going to be on the cruise, which will end up being part of the story later. So I met, in particular, a couple of people I talked to for a long time who were just very nice, who were going on the cruise. And so anyway, as it attained Category 5 status on October 17th, I guess, and when peak intensity was 180 miles an hour. I was going from memory before. Didn't know. I forgot I wrote these down. And it was the third strongest Pacific hurricane on record. There was a weakening phase, and it weakened due to the eye wall in the wind shear. Like, it weakened, but not until after the cruise started. It weakened down to a Category 3 hurricane by the 19th and a tropical storm by the 20th. So as you can see, we're leaving on the 18th. We're getting on this ship. Everybody at that cocktail party is super nervous. Like, what's going to happen? Is this going to actually happen? We all get on the ship. We go, and then all of a sudden we're heading out, and they come over the intercom and they say, "Don't worry, folks. We're going to go around the hurricane." Now, you saw the pathway earlier. The pathway was just headed down to just Mazatlan and Puerto Vallarta. So they're like, we're going to go around the hurricane and kind of circle back around and keep on the itinerary, which I believe was Puerto Vallarta was going first or something like that. Anyway, long story short, we went way, way out into the ocean. We're like 2 days out into the ocean. So by October 19th, when it was Category 3, the hurricane was switching direction and started to come out toward us. So we're out in the middle of the ocean, and the hurricane's coming toward us. And we didn't have much of a choice at that point. They just tried to go through the hurricane to try to get to the other side. There were about, I would say, 18 hours, maybe more, maybe a day and a half of severe storm, but about 18 hours of such intense rocking, I can't even tell you. And to give you an idea, there was no way to walk. At first, we're sitting in the dining room, and the waiters are walking around, and they're carrying these trays, and people were dropping them everywhere. They couldn't carry the food trays, so they're like, everybody's got to clear out of the dining room, because they couldn't even bring out the food. They couldn't even deal with it, and it was just a sudden mess everywhere. And then I remember walking by the pools, and the pools were sloshing completely out. You couldn't walk anywhere near them because everything was getting covered in water, and you were grabbing onto anything you could just to stay stable. And then I remember walking down the halls and having to hold the sides of the walls just to kind of stay up. And then once you got to your room, it got so intense at night that I had to crawl when I needed to go to the bathroom. I couldn't even walk in my own room. It was that intense. The rocking was that intense. We were on the 7th floor of the cruise ship, and the waves were crashing. The boat was listing, and the waves were crashing over our room. You just saw solid walls of water repeatedly. And this was, I will say, one of the scarier situations I've been in. This went on for hours. I mean, there were times it was better than others, and it just seemed like everybody on this ship was sick. People were throwing up everywhere. It was a nightmare. But what was kind of amazing is it did eventually end. They did make landfall at Mazatlan, winds of 60 miles an hour. It dissipated shortly after moving inland on October 21st. So there was a little bit of a help. It did actually come up, and remember the original graphic is that it did brush. I mean, it was not intended to hit Baja California or Cabo, which is at the tip of Baja California, but in fact it did brush Baja California, so it impacted our direct path. And this was a very scary cruise, and finding out later that about half the ship, or maybe about 25% of the ship, people just chose not to go. Like they said, no, there's a hurricane happening. There's no way we would go. And I can't tell you, I was thinking many times that was probably the smart thing to do. But when you're in the middle of that much danger, you really don't think about those things. You just think about staying alive. And really, I was just thinking about, how do I you go minute to minute, and what's going to happen, and do we go to get the lifeboat and the life jackets and all that stuff. But it was a pretty scary situation. The outcome is, at the very end, I found out, in fact, one of the people I talked to at that party had passed away during that event, and found out another woman passed away when she fell down the stairs during the hurricane. So she was trying to go down the stairs, I guess tripped or fell and hit her head and passed away. So there were 2 deaths on the cruise. The interesting thing is, officially there are 3 deaths that happened, but they don't count, I guess, what happens on the cruise ship. And it was interesting what the outcome was, because everyone I went with, there was a small group of people I was with, not one of them has gone on another cruise, not a single one, except me. We'll talk about that. But the terror that people felt, they did not want to repeat that again. So it was a pretty harrowing experience.
So I don't think Sammy and I expected the death story part at the end. We were just like, okay. And then the death part, I'm like, oh, I definitely would have stayed home for sure.
Well, we didn't know that was going to happen.
Yeah, but now I definitely don't want to get on a cruise.
Yeah, right before this, you're saying how great cruises are, and you've never been on one.
I know. And now there's murders happening on. No. Wow, that's scary, though. Yeah, I would have been freaked out.
That's a good plot for a movie.
Right?
Like a murder mystery on a boat. Sorry, I'm getting off topic.
Well, it was all very sad. I mean, it was actually
horrible.
It was actually very sad, and it's interesting because, of course, word gets out, but there's a lot of, they do a lot to kind of cover those things up, the cruise ship industry. But this brings me, so I'm thinking about this. Oddly enough, there was something else that happened tourism-wise, which was about protesters in Barcelona. And we're going to talk about how these two things kind of intersect. The protesters in Barcelona demonstrate against mass tourism. Brian, you've been to Barcelona?
I have.
And what about you, Sammy?
I haven't.
It's one of the most magical cities. It is actually one of my favorite cities in the world, and not necessarily for the architecture, although that's quite famous there. It's really for the people that I just was kind of blown away by how wonderful these people are. So I was a little bit surprised when I saw this, this movement happening, until I looked into it a bit more. So let's talk about it. Protesters in Barcelona are demonstrating against mass tourism. The demonstrators march through popular tourist areas, and they're chanting, "Tourists go home." And they used water pistols against the tourists. So they're squirting the tourists with water pistols. It's just amazing. Now, there were 2,800 people who demonstrated, according to Barcelona's city council, and over 100 local organizations participated. So this wasn't like a fly-by-night thing. This was an organized protest that a lot of people got involved in. Have you ever seen anything like this?
No. I mean, I just know the French don't really like American tourists.
And Hawaii.
And Hawaii too. I know it's a big issue with the surfers, the local surfers, and especially the military that's stationed there. It's always been a little bit of issues that they get into. But I did have a time when I went to Sitges, which is pretty close to Barcelona. And we were at the bar, and they weren't serving us. They weren't even paying attention to us until I spoke Spanish to them. And then they changed completely. It was a whole different group of people now. Yeah.
I feel so weird because I've been there twice, and I just thought that
You had a good experience.
every
yeah.
single person I came across was absolutely amazing. Like, I was just falling in love left and right. These, you'd walk and it just these old elderly women, you would hug them. I mean, it was some kind of weird experience I was having. I don't know, I was putting out some kind of odd scent that day, maybe, who knows, but I just really had a great time. But Barcelona is a tourist town. It's a tourist destination, and it's also a cruise ship port. So let's talk about that. In fact, the cruise ships are kind of part of this problem. There's 26 million overnight visitors that happen in 2023, and nearly 13 billion spent by tourists in 2023. And issues were raised by people who live there. They're all of a sudden their prices are going up even more. And remember, this is post-pandemic. This is happening all over the world. And people are all pent up for, a couple of years. And all of a sudden they want to go on these tourist quests. So what are they doing? The locals are price gouging. They're raising the prices on everything, raising the prices on meals, raising the prices on rents, etc. So they have increased prices now in the city. There's more pressure on the public services, and their social inequality is widening. So anytime you have that mix, especially social inequality, you can often see these protests happen because people want to take the power back. There's a housing crisis also in Barcelona. What do you think that's caused by? Anybody?
The tourists.
Airbnb, yes.
Well, it's happening a lot in Mexico City too. It's a big issue because it's exactly the same thing that's happening in Barcelona.
Yeah, so the rents have increased by 68% in the past 10 years. 68%. And the cost of buying a house in Barcelona is up 38%. I think it's higher here, but over 10 years, definitely. But it's just really quite a big deal. So the protesters wanted closure of the cruise ship terminals and more regulation on tourist accommodations like Airbnb, and into the public spending on tourism promotion. Because a lot of places, we see this all the time, will advertise, come visit us, because it brings a lot of dollars into the local economy. The government, just to say, the government did respond. So these did work to an extent. They increased the nightly tourist tax to €4. I mean, €4, that's $4 for the American audience, essentially. Limit on cruise ship passengers, and that probably is helpful. And a plan to end apartment rentals for tourists by 2028. So there is a plan in place. And that's a pretty significant thing. And they're also making measures to make housing more affordable to Barcelona residents.
That's awesome.
I thought that was pretty cool. Yeah. So they are listening, but there's a broader context to this. This is happening all over Spain, but it's happening other places too. But it's happening all over Spain, like the Canary Islands and Mallorca. And this is a common issue in tourist spots nationwide, or worldwide. And there are global initiatives right now to combat over-tourism. That's increased tourist taxes, campaigns to discourage problematic visitors, and attendance caps at popular attractions. I'm sorry, attendance caps to discourage problematic visitors. Is that code for Americans, you guys?
We do tend to stir some...
People tend to say you hear Americans before you see them.
Oh my goodness!
Wow,
and I will tell you, I have been in some. I was telling Brian earlier, but I've been in some places where I've encountered Americans who were incredibly rude. And I remember being in Mexico on a bus, and and I was taking a bus, the local bus, and it was really the only way to get from the beach back to the city. And so I'm on this bus and, sitting there all quietly in the back, but there's a group of American tourists who were screaming and yelling and laughing and just being super loud. And there were people on the bus who were obviously commuting. I mean, just families and different things. And all of a sudden this guy stood up, Mexican citizen, stood up and said, will you shut up? To this group of Americans. Now, to the Americans' credit, they did shut up, but they didn't apologize. They were being really obnoxious. So it was just kind of an interesting kind of situation to happen, just to watch that happen. Which brings me to, I wouldn't even talk about these tourist things, but we wanted to talk about this study that I found somewhat fascinating, how tourists respond to anger and fear when traveling. Because actually there's a study that came out, so this is the reality of travel emotions. When we travel, we have all kinds of emotions. We don't know what's going to happen. Things are going to happen. It could be... who knows what happens when you travel? I always say there are tons of mistakes that happen. Bad things can happen. You kind of have to prepare for that. You kind of have to be willing to roll with the punches. You get to your hotel and they don't give you the room you asked for, or they don't even give you a room. And then you have to find a place suddenly, or you miss your connection, or your connection is running late. This is a common one. Or people, I've had my luggage lost. Actually in Barcelona.
Mine was Madrid.
Oh, I had Barcelona, and the other one where it was lost was in Venice.
Oh, wow.
Both. I eventually got the luggage back, but a couple of days later. So that was kind of fun. Things can happen. Things can happen. So, let's talk about these emotions. What happens? So, advertisements don't you see when you see advertisements for travel, you see fun and it's carefree? No?
Always,
yes.
Yeah. They always try to sell you on the fun, and you're going to have the best experience of your life,
I saw an advertisement for New Jersey the other day. They were trying to get me to go there. I live there.
But you gotta admit the Jersey Shore is actually kind of nice. No.
Yeah, but it's New Jersey. I get advertising for something tropical, something touristy, but
New Jersey.
New Jersey.
I know.
Advertising the state?
It's very sweet. I hear they're not advertising Atlantic City. That one's more of a challenge, I actually think. But yeah, I thought I was so surprised about New Jersey. Actually has some pretty nice spots. But I get what you're saying. I absolutely get it. So the truth is, travel can evoke frustration. It can evoke fear. And there's this recent study sheds light on how tourists handle these emotions. So this study by the Middle Tennessee University and Temple University. So it's kind of wild. And the study is published in the Journal of Travel Research. And they studied 1,800 potential tourists, and they had them focus on scenarios. So when you do a study, you actually have because they could ask people their travel nightmares, but it's kind of a tainted group because no one has the same travel nightmare. So what they did is they wrote up these travel nightmares, and they said, they basically asked people, how would this affect you? What would your intention be, et cetera, et cetera. And they went through several scenarios. They looked at overcrowding. They looked at harassment by vendors. Boy, these sound pretty common. Like getting harassed by people on the street or overcrowding. There could also be pickpocketing and all kinds of things. And they examined emotional responses of anger and fear. Have you ever been angry on vacation, Brian?
Well, like you said, the hiccups happen, and if it doesn't go my way exactly, I might get a little frustrated here and there.
And you, Sammy?
I've really only gone on vacations with my family, and I feel like whatever hiccups we have, they take care of.
Well, and a family vacation can be filled with all kinds of repressed rage. I don't know, but
if we go over 4 or 5 days, I could need some me time, but nothing no hotels to stay at.
Okay. Well, no big problems.
No big problems for me, at least. I don't know. Maybe my parents have faced them, and
I'm sure they have.
Not noticed.
I'm sure they have, and good for them for kind of shielding you from that, because I can guarantee you they did. That's just part of the picture. So the results were pretty interesting. When somebody feels anger, what do you think people do? I was kind of fascinated by this.
What do you mean? Like when an angry person?
Well,
like,
do they never want to go back to the place? Do they
I feel like
punish
they just, like,
them?
Yell. They,
I'm
like,
very
yell
big
until
on
they
I'm
get
never
their
coming
way.
back.
They
Oh,
can
really?
yell.
And I won't say it to like the staff, but or whatever's happening, but it'll be very much like I never want to come back here again if it's an issue.
Yeah, you would think that. But the study, and I have to say, and I was taken by this, tourists actually suppress their feelings a lot or reframe their feelings. And what was interesting to me is when looking at these scenarios, had that same experience without knowing the results. Because like when I looked at the Barcelona events, I thought, well, not me. That wouldn't happen to me. And why wouldn't it happen to me? I'd be a tourist there. I just wasn't there when they had squirt guns. That's essentially it. But I didn't fault them like the Barcelona residents for getting upset. I also didn't fault them. I saw this as just an issue, and it's a real issue. So yeah, I had to say I reframed my own, reaction to these things. And when I've been angry before, I always think of, I'm visiting. I'm a guest in whatever country I'm in. I'm a guest here. So. But the next one is fear, and it's much harder to overcome, and it leaves a lasting impact. And this, have you felt fear on vacation ever?
No, I don't think I have. Like, I'm trying to think of like a time where I felt like scared, genuinely, like how your situation on the cruise. I don't know if I'd go on a cruise again after that, but no, I don't think I've ever felt scared. I mean, anywhere dangerous or anything like that. No.
The reality is I felt fear, but I had been boating so much before that I think that helped. And a lot of the people I talked to, this was their very first time on the ocean, except for maybe the occasional, I don't know, glass bottom boat, who knows. But the reality is every one of the people I went with never went on another cruise. And that actually is one of the findings, is that people really don't, when they feel fear, when they're pickpocketed or robbed, when they're threatened, when there's a natural disaster, they often don't want to return to the place that they've been to. This is something in psychology we call aversion training, one trial training. It's an aversion stimulus. It's something that's aversive that was delivered to them that caused them fear. And when we feel fear, we learn in one trial. We have one trial learning. That means we only have to experience a feared experience one time to stay away from it. That's how we learn. That's how our brains work. So this made perfect sense to me. But when it came to anger, people, they roll with that punch, which I thought was a pretty great thing.
That makes sense.
When traveling.
I got kind of chased by monkeys in Thailand, so I mean, I already had this thing where I don't like monkeys, like at all. I hate them. But it's like I saw that group of monkeys and I felt that they were going to come after me. And I thought because I had a coconut, like they have coconuts everywhere. Why would they want my coconut? And yeah, I had to end up throwing it for them because they
might
came
as well
after me.
peeled a banana and then like dangled it in front of them.
But I thought they just had bananas everywhere too. I would have been like, whatever.
No,
they would want something better.
No, that's one thing with. I remember when I was in Mexico, I could tell I've been to Mexico many, many times, and I remember you could not carry a banana from the dining room to your room at this resort I was staying because the Gila monsters, whatever they are, the things on the ground, the little Godzillas, chase you around. I mean, they literally chase you to get the banana. But this also brings me to another Mexico. Oh my God, I can't believe I've had these experiences in Mexico, because in Mexico, I was swimming off the coast of Puerto Vallarta, and I was way out there with a friend, and we were treading water. See, Puerto Vallarta, we went way out and swam way out, and we're treading water and just talking and laughing and, whatever you do, like hanging out on the beach in Mexico. And all of a sudden, I felt like an electrical cable had been attached to my arm, and what happened was I was hit by a stingray that stung my elbow, and it was the most painful and scary thing that happened, and I could barely swim back. I mean, like, it was so hard for me to get back. I remember that was the longest swim, and my friend at first thought I was joking. He's like, ah ha ha, because I was like, ah, and then whatever, I don't know what I did, and I just panicked and started swimming in, and he was later like, what happened? I thought you were joking. What was going on? But yeah, I was stung, and I had to go into the beach, and the doctor actually told me, he goes, that is the worst sting I've ever seen. He goes, buy yourself a lottery ticket. That's the worst sting, and you're still alive. The interesting thing is, it was about my arm. At its biggest distance is probably about 8 to 10 inches from my heart. So the little sting could have gone over into my heart, which is how the naturist Steve, what's his name, died. Yeah.
Damn, that's scary. That's one of my biggest fears too in the ocean. I'm always trying to do the stingray shuffle, but I never would have imagined they're just out on the water.
They're just out swimming. Yeah, but what was so interesting to me was that how many people said, "Hey, did you do the stingray shuffle? Like, why didn't you do that?" And I said, I was swimming.
Shuffle?
Well, apparently when you're walking into the ocean,
You
like at
shuffle
the
your
coast, that they are like sunning themselves along the shore.
So you don't step on it.
And you shuffle your feet, and they'll swim away, apparently.
They'll feel the vibration, so they swim away, so you don't step on
Yeah.
it and get stung.
But you can't do it when you're swimming, and there's no place to put your feet when you're actually out in the ocean. But I can't tell you how many people said that to me, and it was kind of infuriating. So
Yeah, because it's on your elbow. How did you step on it and it hit you on the elbow?
it was something.
Wow.
But what's interesting is I never went back into the ocean in Puerto Vallarta. Never, ever, ever went back in. And
I wouldn't have either.
And once I was snorkeling in, I'll travel stories apparently, but once I was snorkeling in Cancun in this preserve. It was absolutely beautiful, and I was between two coral reefs, and I was snorkeling, and so I'm between these coral reefs, so I'm trying to swim through it carefully, because you can cut yourself if you hit the edges. So I'm trying to swim through it carefully to the other side, and along comes the largest stingray I've seen. This is after I've been stung in Puerto Vallarta. So I would never go into the ocean again in Puerto Vallarta. Now I see the biggest stingray in the world, and it turns, looks at me, and then looks back and keeps swimming. And I had what I would tell you would be the equivalent of a panic attack at that moment. I knew I couldn't make a lot of movement because I would hit the coral and I couldn't go forward, and I just tried to stay as still as I could. It swam by. Eventually it went by. When I told the guy, I said, "Oh, I saw this," and he goes, "Oh, how big was it?" And I said this. He goes, "Oh my God." And that's, they had some name for it. Like, it was, they knew about that particular one. It was so big. So I will tell you, I may never go and snorkel again. Like literally, these fear experiences really do take hold. So although when I was preparing this story, I was thinking about the hurricane thing because I didn't feel afraid, but I kind of forgot about these ones where I did feel afraid, and it did have a lasting effect.
Yeah, I would have been like, fuck the coral. I'm jumping onto the coral and getting out of here one way or another. Oh, no. How scary.
So when tourists feel anger, they tend to engage in reappraisal. They'll look at the situation differently, which is a good thing to do when you're cognitively. They tend to also engage in suppression. They'll contain the emotion. They'll say, "Oh, I'm angry," but like me when I'm in a foreign country, I will say, "I'm a guest in their country. I need to be mellow here." Like I tend to be very mindful of, I'm an American visiting their country. And I think as a result, I haven't had any negative experiences with people. Mm-hmm. I've had, obviously, negative experiences with stingrays and hurricanes.
Just nature.
Just nature comes to get me, but not with people. It's easier, but it is easier to recover from anger. With fear, I talked about the one trial learning. Fear is much, much harder to overcome than anger. And often anger starts with an initial fear response. But once we get over the fear, we feel anger because it empowers us. So other incidents like robbery lead to avoidance of a destination. We already talked about that. We learn to avoid things we don't like that we're afraid of. So what are the implications for the tourism industry? Ensure the tourists don't experience fear to maintain their loyalty. And this is kind of an interesting thing. So I guess plain old safe and secure environment is the thing to do. So when you're in Mexico and you see all those guys standing there with machine guns and things, it's always a little upsetting, but I guess funny, that's what they're there to do.
In Mexico City, I remember we went to a restaurant and there was like security guards around the patio, and I was like, are they for the restaurant or like is somebody here? And they're like, oh yeah, it's just in case somebody comes up to the table and snatches something.
Wow. Yeah. So Brian, have you ever had a travel experience that...
Well, mine wasn't like so scary. It was just more like culturally had to learn some new things. I was in Shanghai and I was going to Disneyland, and apparently that morning I drank some juice. I guess something was in the water. Something was wrong, but I started feeling it on the subway that I was feeling not well. And then we finally got there, and it really hit me as soon as we got through the gates of Disneyland. And I ran into the restroom, and like there was only one stall open, and I had never seen. Is it a squatter?
Oh, there's just a hole in the ground.
It's just a hole in the ground.
And two handles, right?
It was just like, yeah, but it looked so confusing that I stood there for a minute like, how do I do this? Like, do I lay down? It was so dumb that it was very like, I've never seen this. Like, I don't know what I'm doing in this situation.
So it wasn't to throw up?
No, it was not to throw up, I would say. So if it was throw up, I'm good at the sink. I'll throw up in any sink. I have a bad habit of throwing up in sinks.
It's good to know.
Yeah, that was a big learning
mental note.
Yeah, don't let me throw up in your house. I'll throw up in a sink.
And what did you like? What was your response to this?
It was just something that they're used to, and I am not. Clearly we didn't grow up with that setup. So it was just like, okay, now I know better. I can handle this situation at ease, at least. Now I know what I would be doing instead of questioning it, because I really was like, is this the right thing? Like I was like,
nobody told you. Nobody told you.
It was so foreign too. Like it was cold and I was trying to find gloves, and the whole language barrier was a whole nother situation that I ended up having to buy like Mickey Mouse big, the Mickey Mouse hand, because that's the only thing that they had I could find. So it was very, I only lasted like an hour, because even the smell of like the churros and stuff,
food,
it would make me nauseous. So my Disney day kind of sucked on that one.
Oh, you were only there a total of 1 hour? Did you ever go back?
No.
Oh, I've always thought that'd be cool to go to Shanghai Disneyland.
Yeah, it was horrible for me, my personal, like internally. And
but do you ever want to go back? No, seriously. Do you ever want to go back?
I don't see the need to.
So let's talk about that, because when we have an aversive stimulus, and this is what happened, and it got paired with your trip to Disneyland.
Yeah.
So do you ever want to go back to Shanghai? Do you associate it with the whole city, or just
I feel like that
day?
whole experience was just like not pleasant, you know.
When we would deliver an aversive experience like that, it can be one trial learning. So you may never want to go back there.
Yeah.
You may never want to go back to Shanghai Disneyland.
No.
And, you know, I want to go back to Barcelona because I had wonderful times there. Never got in the water. There is water there.
Oh,
I
yeah.
just never got in it.
I want to go to Mallorca, as you mentioned. That's one of the ones that's being a big tourist attraction. But it looks beautiful. So
Mallorca I've been to twice, and it is absolutely stunning.
Ooh, okay.
I have to say, it's a little Newport Beach with ancient history combined. Like it's got very upscale and boats and beautiful, and it's got history and ancient ruins and spectacular, and the people are really a trip. I mean, they're actually very nice too. So I was convinced that there wasn't a rude person in Spain. So I was a little floored by this particular study. So
I'm glad you had a good experience.
So I wanted to go and talk about the loss of a legend in the world of psychology, and she was a media psychologist. Her name was Dr. Ruth Westheimer. She just died at the age of 96. And we're going to talk about her and her life. I listened to Dr. Ruth. Who didn't? Did you listen to Dr. Ruth?
I just found out about her the other day.
Just found out?
I know. I should have known.
Well, I mean, she might be a little before your time. You never listened to her, Brian?
No.
Dr. Ruth was a sex therapist, but her charm was that she was like a very small, diminutive person with a very thick German accent who had a high, squeaky, raspy voice, who talked about sex in almost kind of a pointed, factual way, but somehow conveyed warmth and understanding and acceptance in every answer she gave. So she was really kind of a magical combination. She was not a threatening person, but she was someone who could really deliver on the information. She was born Carola Ruth Siegel in Frankfurt, Germany. Her parents were Orthodox Jews, but then in November 9th, 1938, there was Kristallnacht. Do you guys know Kristallnacht from history?
No.
Well, okay, well, I'm very, very concerned. This is a big one. Kristallnacht in 1938, anti-Semitic mobs in Germany and Austria went on violent rampages that left thousands of Jewish homes and businesses in ashes. They broke all the windows and vandalized and lit things on fire, and it was just this whole negative attack on people who are Jewish. This is in the 30s, before things. This was at the start of things really getting bad. Westheimer's father was arrested by Nazi authorities a week later in Germany. So that's when her father went away, and then she in 1939 was part of something called Kindertransport. She was sent to Switzerland with other children. She was 10 years old, and she was sent there. All the kids were sent kind of orphans. They couldn't get the adults out, but they could send the kids out. So they sent her for safety away from the Nazi persecution. She never knew exactly what happened to her family, but the assumption is they perished in Auschwitz. Auschwitz is a concentration camp, one of the most infamous in Poland. Really a bad one. So there she was, living in a Swiss orphanage, and she worked as a maid, and they didn't give her much schooling at all. She just was the maid, and she didn't get along with the people that were there, and she was kind of a little upstart. You've got to understand the level of trauma that she and the other kids just experienced. And they're growing up. They can't speak the language. They're growing up in this other country, or maybe they grew up, maybe they were speaking German in their part of Switzerland. Who knows? But they really had a rough time. And she went on, she met a dude, and they moved to Paris, and she got a psychology degree from the Sorbonne, which is pretty amazing. Then she moved to in the U.S. in 1956, and then I'm shortening her whole story, but she won a scholarship for sociology at the New School for Social Research. She went through a couple of guys, and then she did marry this third guy, but she was going through, I think she was on guy number 2 at that point. At the beginning of her career in the 1960s, she worked for Planned Parenthood, and that's where she developed her interest in sex education. She earned a doctorate in education from Columbia University in 1970. This woman is no slouch. She didn't speak, the language, and she came here and just really took it on and learned and went up the education chain. So she's incredibly smart. And she taught sex counseling at Lehman College and Brooklyn College. And that really led her. They wanted to get a sex expert on the radio. And she did her radio debut in 1980, WYNY. Do you know that one, Sammy?
No.
Oh, and she did a show called Sexually Speaking. It was just 15 minutes, but it quickly, they said, we got to expand this to a whole hour because she kept getting phone calls. She became the top-rated program on the station, and then she got national syndication. She eventually ended up on television. There was the Dr. Ruth Show on Channel 5, and there was Good Sex with Dr. Ruth on Lifetime. So she really skyrocketed. Her show went national. It was widespread popularity. There were college student groups that would like gather to listen to her, because what she did something unique at the time, is she talked very plainly and openly about sex. She also wrote a column. She wrote 24 books, and she was frank, humorous, and gave warm advice. The interesting thing about Dr. Ruth is that she really popped in the age of AIDS. Now, if you really look back in 1980, 81, 82, 83, the early 80s, that's when AIDS was just becoming known, and it was considered this death sentence. And nobody knew how this happened. And then they eventually figured out it was passed sexually. And the only way to prevent it was either to not have sex, which was a lot of people would say that's the solution. Everyone who's at risk should stop having sex. Or you wore a condom during sex. You wore some sort of barrier during sex. And that's when condoms really became a big thing. And I remember her over and over again saying, oh, wear a condom, have sex, wear a condom. She pushed it nonstop. And also when she talked about same-sex relationships, she was not pathological. She stood against a few things, but she was very understanding about many, many sexual preferences, like people, what they like to do. Like, she just didn't see the problem. She was all over the place, and she continued until her life, continuing to write and do things. Some critics saw her commercial success as controversial, and this is very true in my field. There's a lot of pushback about people who've been in the media who are in psychology, and they look at that in a very negative way. And she also, that she made a mistake in her book, one of her books, First Love. She made a mistake about when to have sex, and apparently that haunted her the rest of her life. So she was an ethical woman. I mean, she was, to people that are that concerned about a mistake are, very, they're conscientious, very conscientious. The interesting thing about Dr. Ruth, though, is in looking at her life, is that one of her big criticisms is she never got too deep. She never got deep. She never talked about her own emotions. Even when she wrote a book about herself, she didn't really go too deep. And this had to be a reflection of the amount of trauma and the way that she coped with the world. And she coped with it in a positive, embracing way and made the best out of the life that was given to her. And she even said waking up every day was a privilege. So she continued on, and she just passed away at 96. She leaves a lasting legacy in sex education. And she used to end her podcast, not podcast, what am I saying? She used to end her radio show by always saying, have good sex. bad imitation, but so that's who she is. And Sammy, you told us before that your dad worked with her.
Well, so I got what actually it was.
Oh.
He used to work at a private school in New York, and he used to be like a teacher, and her grandchild went there, so he's been introduced to her, and has like spoken to her briefly, which I think is cool. He mentioned her to me the other day, saying that I should watch the documentary about her.
Yeah,
and I will.
She's an incredible woman. She's certainly impressive and certainly a good example of someone who not only overcame trauma, but really made something spectacular out of herself, out of the worst circumstances. So hats off to Dr. Ruth. Or no, hats on, because she wanted you to wear a condom. So that brings us to the end of the show. That reminder to like, subscribe, and give us 5 stars. If you want links to the studies we talked about today, which is and the articles I'll talk about, and like the pathway of the hurricane, you can look at it all. I put links. Go to my YouTube page, youtube.com/Dr. Greg. Also, if you have any questions or topics you'd like to discover, hit us up on socials at Ask Dr. Greg. This is Dr. Greg Bryan and DJ Sammy G bidding you farewell. Until next time, be present, be flexible, and be kind.